Poker Podcast, where we share stories and strategies from the game's most fascinating minds. No matter where you are in your poker journey, there's always something new to learn. So let's get right into this week's episode.
Welcome back to the Red Chip Poker Podcast. I'm Zach Shaw here with James Split Suit Sweeney. How's it going?
Not too bad. How you doing, sir?
Feeling good. Good to be back. We've been gone for a while, but we're here and we're planning on bringing you guys lots more strategy in 2020. And we're calling this Season 3. And that was James's idea. I love the idea. Can you talk a little bit about why we're calling this Season 3?
So I think this podcast has gone through some different phases, right? We had kind of me as the host early on. We had you as a host for a while. We had Robbie come on and be a host for a while. And I think kind of the stuff that you and I were doing before Robbie came was pretty stratty. So I think that kind of culminates as like a season 1. I think when Robbie came in, it was very interview focused. I think that's kind of a clear season 2. And I think us coming back and doing this together and being more focused on the strategy is definitely looking like a season 3, kind of right back to strategy. And kind of on that point, I know the last time I was on this podcast, you, me, and Robbie were talking about what the podcast was and kind of why we were making some of the decisions that we were with the podcast. And I kind of mentioned there's so much strategy out there already. I don't want to just completely continue throwing more and more strategy and continue repeating myself, honestly, at some points. But I kind of got inspired with this break with my newborn coming into the world and also with all the feedback that we got. So many people were just like, I want the podcast back. Why did the podcast go away? And everyone keeps asking for a strategy. They don't want the interviews. They want strategy because that's what we do at Red Chip. So I thought, you know what? Let's bring it back. Let's have some really focused conversations, at least on a topic, and you and I will just have fun with it. Have a conversation about whatever the topic is. And hopefully this kind of comes off as what people want in terms of the strategy focus and comes off a little bit more conversational rather than, the hardcore strategy videos that we do in pro or sounding like we're reading a core lesson. I don't want that to be the case. I want this to be the podcast. And I think season 3 and kind of keeping it as its own thing, I'm hoping this is exactly what people want because it's what people have been saying that they want. So we're here to deliver.
Absolutely. And like you said, in that podcast, episode number 180, I believe it was, we were talking about how, we really want to focus our strategy content on making great products for people, great stuff in core and pro. And we have been doing that, and we'll probably share a lot of exciting things over the coming episodes. But for now, I'm looking at the topic list that we've got lined up for our next few episodes, and it's great stuff. And it kind of, the theme that's emerging is sort of a back to basics approach. And that's personally what I've been doing in my game. I'm prepping to play my first World Series of Poker bracelet event. And so I've really been getting back to basics, especially with working on my ranges and that sort of thing. So I'm really excited to kind of go over some of the topics that we may have talked about in the past, but with a fresh set of eyes and a fresh perspective, and be able to, continue to illuminate poker strategy for our listeners out there.
Yeah, exactly. And especially on topics that we may have talked about maybe a few years ago, be it in a video or an article or even on the podcast itself. But like you said, taking some fresh eyes at it and saying, okay, what are our current updated thoughts based upon the way the game has changed throughout the years? And that's one of the fun things about doing a podcast like this that spanned multiple years. So that way we can go back and update topics and be like, well, games shifted a little bit here. People are doing this a little bit more now. So how do we react as players that are responding to what's at hand? And kind of the way that I look at, and again, like the comment that I made in, like you said, episode 180 is, you can't go to a table full of nits and think that you're just going to knit it up. You can't go to a table full of, crazy gamblers and think that you're going to out-gamble everybody always. You have to adjust to what's in front of you. Y'all said that you'll want strategy content? Okay, well, I can't just continue saying, let's throw more interviews at you. No, let's do exactly what you want to do. Let's talk strategy. Let's have some fun. Let's start up season 3.
Welcome back to the Red Chip Poker Podcast. I'm Zach Shaw, joined today by James Split Suit Sweeney. How are you doing, sir?
Not too bad. How are you doing, sir?
Doing great. I want to talk to you, and I think you want to talk to me too, about folding too much. And I might be the guy to talk to about that because you've seen me play and you've seen me fold too much. And when I was reading the article that we're basing this conversation on, I was flabbergasted by when you say that we have to be, basically, if you call one street, you should usually continue on the next street. And if we're usually continuing, that should be about 70% of the time. So we should only be folding around 30% of the time. And my brain exploded because I'm definitely not in line with those numbers.
Yeah, I mean, most people aren't. So let's kind of backtrack and talk a little bit about this rule. So this rule comes directly from Miller's book and from the course that I created based upon it called the 1%. And essentially the two rules are that if you bet or raise in poker, you should usually continue again on the next street, continue that aggression along. And if you call on one street, you should typically continue again on the next street. And again, that usually number kind of turns out to be about 70%, but that's like purely averaged over a bunch of different situations. So it's not that, we should always be continuing 70% regardless. Some situations are going to be far, far less. Some are going to actually be higher. But if we kind of work with 70% as a general number, that's a lot higher than what most people continue at, right? A lot of people are probably folding, maybe folding at 70% rather than continuing closer to that. And these are the people that I think really need to hear this conversation. I think there are some people that are a little bit more on the tighter side, which fold too much. There's some people that are a little too fishy and don't fold enough. But I think if you're listening to this podcast, you probably fall more into the tighter side who overfolds, just simply because I don't think the people that are just like incredibly spewy fishy and are actually working on fixing that, I don't think those people are listening to this podcast. So I think we're going to be talking more to people that are folding too often. And I know you are definitely one of those people. I love you. I love your game, but there's some work you need to be doing there in that folding section for sure.
Yeah, I remembered a hand you were watching me play last time we were in Vegas for the meetup. And I don't remember the particulars other than I believe I open raised from the button and was like 3-bet from the big blind or the small blind, and I folded, and you kind of looked at me and you were like there's nothing that you should be folding there. And that was a aha moment reading the article, because I realized, this isn't an isolation of a flop. It goes all the way back to pre-flop, and, your pre-flop really needs to be tight in order to execute this strategy on the flop. And I don't mean tight like nitty, but,
Right, exactly. But not like, exactly. So I think one of the big reasons that I would ever say something like that is almost certainly going to be based upon stack depth, right? I think it's different when we're playing with like 20 big blind stack depth, or you're playing tournaments where you kind of have this like one life to live, and maybe you're in mid to late stages, and you can't be continuing a ton of the time. But when you're talking about having 200, 300, 400 big blind stack depth pre-flop, and you raise pre-flop and you face a 3-bet, and again, we're talking about an effective stack depth that's a little bit deeper, like you should be continuing a good chunk of the time. And when you have position, like you said, you open on the button in that spot, I mean, what the heck are you folding and why? So it's just one of those where like you have position, you have hopefully at least a mild skill edge, or at least you can hold your own, even if it's not a huge edge, you can at least hold your own. You have enough stack in order to continue, and you have enough options post flop. And hopefully you can use all of those things in tandem. That makes continuing far, far, far better than just folding, which again, is what a lot of players do.
Right. I often find myself just making raises sort of like way loose raises in late position, maybe even overvaluing the late position. As we were working on these pre-flop charts that we're going to be putting out, I realized that, I was opening way too wide, just thinking, hey, if it folds around or limps around to me, I can just, smash people with a raise there, and, whether I'm isolating or opening. And in the kinds of games that I play, in the 1-2 games, it's moved very much toward like tons of people are calling everything, every raise, and, calling C-bets, and really, that has kind of bled into the poker population that, you're not going to give up as easily. And so I often find myself in these spots where I kind of, I'm kicking myself for choosing the range that I did pre-flop, when I really should have actually been tighter. Whereas in other situations, I'm playing like way too tight. So it really is very dependent on the dynamics, right?
Oh, 100%. Based on who your opponents are, position, stack depth. I mean, all these things are going to come into play. And when you're talking about tournaments, there's even more variables, because then you have to consider one life to live, and is ICM in effect here, and all these other things as well. So there's a lot to consider. But just if you take like the big picture, which is you're probably folding too much right this moment. If you're folding more than half the time, like every single time you face pressure, almost certainly folding too much. And I think it's kind of important to talk here just a moment about when you might deviate from this kind of folding, right? Because it is okay to fold in situations, clearly, right? Where, I mean, we're not saying continue 100% of the time. And I think it's easy when someone hears a conversation about don't fold so much, the brain automatically hears, okay, well, don't ever fold. And that's clearly not what we're saying. Even if you did adhere strictly to continue 70%, inherently you're folding the other 30%. So there is always some folding going on. And what you're folding, of course, are the worst candidates in your range, right? The hands that just really have no hope, or it's not even like gut shots every single time, right? Those have some hope, those have some equity. And by constantly folding away that equity, that's a problem. It's usually things that just have like no hope whatsoever, no even backdoor potential, or just no real way of winning this pot often enough to make it worthwhile. So I think I lost my train of thought a little bit there.
No, that makes sense to me. Like my question is, as I look at these ranges, I think I'm doing pretty well in terms of like realizing that there's equity on board and I can continue, I can call a C bet because I've got, some equity. But I often find myself in these situations where I've got like, king, queen suited or, two sort of high cards and with the flop and I'm getting C bet into. And I'm always like, is this a position where it's like one of those borderline things where am I supposed to be continuing with this because I've got two overs, or like what? I'm not great on really realizing how much equity I have given, the flop and how they connect to my cards.
Gotcha. And that's something that you would definitely want to spend some off-table work with, right? Is just getting a general sense of how much equity does your king, queen, or your naked over cards have against a general c-betting range. And build your opponent's possible c-betting range like a couple different ways. Say, okay, what if it's fairly strong side weighted? What if there's a decent amount of bluffs and semi-bluffs in there? And what if it's just like the kitchen sink getting thrown at you? Right. So if you can do that and start getting some general sense of, okay, here's how king queen is over cards fares. Here's how middle pair fares. Here's how pocket fives on, jack 7-3 fares, and start getting a general sense of those things. And honestly, if you did that for like 20 minutes a day for a couple of weeks, like you'd get a pretty good sense pretty darn quickly. Now, the hot cold equity isn't the perfect way of looking at this, of course, simply because you're not always going to see every card after that. So you're not always going to be able to get to showdown. And as such, the hot cold equity isn't as applicable, but it gives you a general starting point. And in Flopzilla, if you actually tick, there's a little button in the bottom right corner that you can say, okay, Flopzilla, I want you to calculate the equity up to this street. So for most people, that's just default set to the river. So run it out to showdown. But you could also say you're on the flop, you could say, okay, we'll run this to the next street. So just run it to the turn and you get a general sense that way. And even a hand that may not look all that great can still have a decent chunk of equity. And that's the issue with constantly folding it, is all of that equity, no matter how big or small that equity is, goes away. It automatically goes to zero. You relinquish 100% of it. And if you're folding too much, then you're incentivizing your opponent to bluff you a tremendous amount. And that kind of brings me back to, actually, sorry, I got on track with what I was talking about earlier, is you have to understand your opponent, right? So when we're having this conversation about folding too much, like if your opponent's not taking advantage of that, right? If they're still being incredibly nitty, even though you're tending to fold too often, and they're not adjusting the way that they're betting at you, they're just betting with super, super strong hands, or they're just raising with really, really nuttish ranges, that's where you can actually exploit them by folding, because their range simply doesn't have a proper number of bluffs in it, and you make money by not paying them off with, hands that just aren't going to perform all that well. So it's not a conversation of always continue at X percentage without thinking about anything else. It's not, never fold or always fold. It's think about your opponent, think about how many bluffs they likely have, think about the pot odds you're getting, and then start considering what you can continue with. And oftentimes it's a lot more hands than you probably think. Just because, again, if you're making your decisions based upon, do I have top pair plus, like you're not going to have top pair plus all that much, especially on the flop. And that's just a really good way, if you're taking that kind of model, to make sure that you're folding far too often on the flop and inviting a ton of c-bets against you, especially when your opponents are thinking even just a little bit. It's not difficult to find someone who's folding too often against c-bets, like not difficult at all.
Right. I mean, this reminds me of the last session that I played, because so first of all, like at 1-2, there aren't a ton of people that are bluffing a lot, it seems, especially on like the river. So, but when you do find these people, you can kind of peg them as, okay, this might be someone where I have to call down with a bluff catcher because, they're super active and they're loose and they maybe they show a bluff. And that actually happened to me where this guy, I think, bluffed me out of a hand with, I had top pair, but the board kept getting scarier and scarier as we went on. So, I bet the flop, I checked the turn, it went check, check. And then the river was a brick, but the board was already scary. I had I think ace 9 suited on ace, queen, jack 10 or something like that with, 2 to a suit. Yeah. And he bet 100 and blew me off the hand. And then for the next 2 hours, I just showed him I just saw other players pick off his bluffs like left and right. And I was kicking myself the whole time being like, even though the board was scary like that, I wasn't thinking in my mind about this, continuation thing. Like you really do have to, continue if you're going to be, moving forward with this plan, because also the board isn't necessarily only scary to me. It could be scary to him too.
Exactly. So part of what you just described, I think, is where a lot of people get themselves in trouble, because you looked at the board. That's good. We have to look at that. You looked at your hand strength. You saw top pair, but you saw top pair on a dangerous board, and you weren't thinking as heavily as you should have about your opponent's range, your opponent's frequencies, your opponent's bluff density, the pot odds you were probably getting, and what that all pans out compared to what we just discussed. And a lot of people do this when they have these kind of like marginal hands, be them draws or be them like middle pair, or even be them like top pair mech kicker, or even decently strong hands, but on boards that aren't great. And if you constantly make that mistake of getting so focused on hand strength and forget to think about your opponent's range heavily, you're going to make so many mistakes like this. And those are like prime spots where you're going to find yourself folding too often. Most people, especially, once the pot starts getting a little bit more expensive, tend to get a little bit more foldy, and then they do a little bit more hero call-y. And the ones that do get hero call-y are usually pretty easy to identify, and they can have some serious swings in a single session for sure.
Yeah. When I was analyzing the hand later and I was working through those ranges, because you're absolutely right, I wasn't working through it at the table. Yeah, and it's almost an emotional reaction, because it's just kind of like, in that particular hand, there were 2 limpers. Isolation raise. That's an isolation raise, right, on the button?
If you're raising 1 or more limpers, that's considered an isolation, yes.
Okay, got that one. So I bumped it up to 20, got 2 callers and the blinds, and then the limper called. So now I flop top pair with this dangerous board, and my mind goes into crazy mode, half of the brain's excited that I got top pair and gut shot straight draw. And the other half is like, oh man, they could have this and they could have that and they could have that. And one of the things that I noticed looking at the pre-flop range charts that we're working on is I used to really overvalue any 2 pink cards. I noticed that, those are being trimmed out of a lot of the ranges, not necessarily king queens or anything, but, king jack or, queen 10 or something like that, king 10. Mm-hmm. And so I always fear that the limpers are always getting in with hands like that. They're just going to, limp in with any 2 pink cards. And so that's what made it particularly scary, because I thought to myself, well, they could have the straight here. They could have 2 pair here very easily. Those are well within their range. And yet, it's an emotional reaction. I'm not thinking about all of the other possibilities that, that whiff on that board, or that are just essentially just drawing because they have some sort of equity.
Yeah, and let's be very clear. Your fold could be 100% correct. Right? It's not to say that inherently because you folded you were wrong or anything like that. Or, I think the way you described the board is that it's a 4 straight. So I don't blame you for being tighter in that spot, especially if you're not confident on your opponent. 2 things kind of come to mind. One is, always slow down, always put the hand reading on, always think about what they would have raised with or not raised with on prior streets. Right? A lot of people forget that. And especially if you have opponents that tend to fast play their stronger hands on the flop, especially if the flop is maybe a little bit more connected, then when they're calling, maybe it's not as scary. But again, that doesn't necessarily mean he didn't improve on the turn or river. So I don't want to go too far down that rabbit hole. And then the other part of that, thinking about your opponent, sorry, ADDing a little bit. Oh, goodness. Is make sure that you said you started kicking yourself a little bit later in the session because you folded here and then you saw the same exact villain making a lot of bluffs in future sessions or throughout the rest of the session. You really don't want to beat yourself up over that, because you did the best you could, hopefully, with the information that you had at that moment. You're going to get more information as the session goes on. That's just the way it works when you're paying a lot of attention. But don't go back and say, oh, I totally misplayed that hand because he turned out later to be a complete bluff box. Like, if you didn't know that at the time, then don't use that information when you're going back and reviewing that hand, especially if it's going to lead to you kicking yourself, because that just defeats the whole purpose.
That's true. That's very true. You kind of replay it in your mind. You're like, oh, he was even giving off tells. And you're like,
Yeah.
When I read the hand, I was like, yeah, this isn't a horrible mistake. Like, it's close if it's, if I'm wrong. But I sort of had that feeling like I was confused by the hand because I hadn't had a clear thought process through the hand. And you kind of realize so many hands almost, play themselves. And I think that's kind of obvious for a lot of, more experienced poker players out there. This is standard, that's standard. But it's these weird hands that really, highlight, hey, you need to get your thought process in line, because these are the kind of make or break hands that determine whether you have a winning or losing session a lot of the time.
100%. 100%. And the thing with folding is really curious, because a lot of times when people are folding too much, they're typically folding too much on earlier streets, right? So maybe they're losing a bunch of small pots, but they're usually getting out of things early and they're not feeling a tremendous amount of pain, right? They'd feel a lot more pain if they didn't fold, ended up losing that pot into a much, much bigger one. All of a sudden, that's the one that sticks in their brain, not the smaller folds that happened. The fact that you even remembered, raising on the button, getting 3-bet and folding is probably only because I made a comment about it. Otherwise, you'd probably just completely ignore that hand, and no one would really blame you for it. It's a pretty standard thing, just, forget the small pots. But those are the ones you have to be remembering and studying later, because if you're just constantly folding these little small pots away, your brain's not going to remember them particularly well. That's a problem. And then you're going to continue doing it because there's no pain associated with it. But again, you're just leaving equity on the table. You're leaving opportunity on the table. And it's not that you need to take every single opportunity, even if it's 0.0001 plus EV. Right? You still have to kind of gauge, general ROI on the risk you have to go for. But if you're constantly folding too much, right? If you face a 3-bet, you're always folding against it unless you have kings plus. If you're facing raises pre-flop and you're not defending very often, especially like on the button, well, why? Again, you're just fold, even with hands that are totally playable. Or if you're, post-flop facing c-bets and you're just constantly fold. That can happen. You could have a session where just you completely whiff aggressively every single time. Sure, you're probably going to end up folding a little bit. But if this is happening like session after session, like, you probably don't even realize that it's happening, but you're probably losing half to a full buy-in every single session. You're wondering what the heck's happening, especially on sessions where you're not catching your sets, you're not getting anything big going. Those are almost always going to be indicators that, well, you're probably folding a little too much. And that, again, can add up in a very, very big way. It can be very detrimental to your win rate.
Yeah. I want to be picked off on a bluff every once in a while so that I know that I'm, bluffing enough. And I want to be, I want to lose and understand why I lost and have it be a sound, line. Like, that isn't something that happens to me that often, because I, like many players, try and avoid the pain. I'm not like old man coffee over there, only opening aces and kings and only continuing with, trips or a set or better. But that wouldn't be a fun game. And so to some people, it seems like that's the only reason they're there, is to fold everything but the nuts and hopefully get called by someone who has no idea that they're doing that it doesn't understand ranges. I've seen it happen at that session that I played. That guy walked off the table with like up 2 buy-ins, and he only played like 3 hands. So like,
exactly,
you can get that negative, or you get the sense that it's a good thing when you see some results like that, but then you realize that person is the definition of folding too much.
Exactly. And it's not to say there's like, you can't make money if you're folding a lot, right? If you're in the right game, if you are in the right seat, if you're at the right place at the right time, you can still walk away profit, right? It's not to say that someone who folds too much in a single session or over multiple sessions is always 100% going to lose. That's not the case. But if you're looking to move up, inherently there's going to be fewer fish and there's going to be more regs, and the regs are inherently going to be better, which means they're going to be better apt at finding weaknesses in your strategy. And someone who folds too much, it is the easiest thing in the world to, 1, identify them, and 2, take advantage of them, right? Think about you and your strategy. How often are you looking for players who are folding too much? That way you can bluff them with impunity. Like, that's the bread and butter of my entire strategy. Find people who fold too much, find people who fold too much in X situation, try to put them in X situation as much as possible, and then punish. And it doesn't really matter what I have. So I can find myself in spots where I'm completely unbalanced. I have far too many bluffs in the situation, but it doesn't matter because my opponent's folding too much. And every single one of those extra bluff combos that I add into my range just nets me extra and extra money. Am I going to lose the pot sometimes? Sure. But are they folding far too much? Yeah, which means that I make money in the long run, even on goofy double and triple barrels, just, again, taking advantage of weaknesses in their strategy.
Totally. And one of my favorite things to do in watching you play is in seeing you get picked off on a bluff every once in a while, because number one, you do it with class and grace. You're just like, okay, nice hand, you don't take it personally. It's not an emotional thing for you. You've done it a million times. So I really appreciate that. And I will, I'm inspired now to target those players, to look at my own folding frequencies. And I'm going to read the article a couple more times, check out my pre-flop range charts, and I got a home game tonight, so I can give it a shot. And we can hook people up with this article. We'll put it in the show notes, redchippoker.com/ what episode are we on now? 183. No, 184. Sorry, 184. And we'll put a link to that article and some other resources. Like, of course, we've got Core, which is full of information that you need to kind of put all these pieces together. And then Pro, which you can join our group coaching session and talk poker with a coach, or you can check out our vast library of videos, some of which deal with folding. And what else? Any parting thoughts on folding too much, James?
Yeah, I think the one thing that you really have to pay attention when it comes to folding and remember is, again, look for players who are folding too much. And if you are folding too much in situations, you have to understand that good players are going to pick that off and they're going to make adjustments against you. And it's going to be very, very difficult for you to discern, especially if you're playing live. You're not getting to that many spots against that person, especially in the short term. You're just going to find yourself folding. I mean, just go back and review, say, the last 5 to 10 hands where you folded, and really look at that spot and say, why did I fold here? And if you're making the assessment based upon whatever hand or range you're assigning your opponent, then actually go plug that into Flopzilla. See how much equity your hand actually had, and see if that fold actually was correct. And remember, it's not just, are you folding too much right this moment? It's also thinking about, okay, by folding, you're not giving yourself a chance to play a future street, which means you're not forcing your opponent to either show up with a real hand or to show up with another bluff, right? It's so easy to tell ourselves the story of, oh, they're going to double barrel me here, so I have to fold against the first one. I don't want to call and then feel like a fish when I fold to the second bet that I know is coming. But then you call and that bet doesn't come. Or you improve, your opponent check folds. Again, like that happens way more often than you probably realize. And it's so easy to tell yourself this story. But the issue is the good players are paying attention to that story. The weakness in your strategy is that you're folding too much. It's super easy to take advantage and they don't have to risk that much to do it. So again, find players who are folding too much, take advantage of that, but then also make sure to protect yourself against better regs because they're out there. They're looking for the folds in your game, be them against 3-bets pre-flop or against double or triple barrels or even against C-bets. So protect yourself. Folding, okay, makes sense in the right spots, but don't be so quick to fold every single time. Remember, there's always raising as an option when you have nothing. It's not just you have to call or fold. There's also coming over the top. So don't limit your options.
And it can be fun. You can work on it through exposure therapy to not be so scared about the bluffs. And when you pull off those bluffs, I mean, there's just nothing more fun in poker.
It's confidence building. And then if you get caught, whatever. Now you have a new image and now you adjust to that. How are people going to play against you in the future? Again, there's a lot of cool things that come from this instead of just playing super nitty and super straightforward. It can be okay in some spots, in some games, but don't let it get away from you because it's easy to, I promise.
Awesome. Well, thanks for this conversation, James, as always. And we'll be back with you next week on another poker strategy topic. Sound good?
Excellent. Take care, y'all.
All right. Take it easy and be good.
Thanks for tuning in to this week's episode. But don't stop learning now. Head over to redchippoker.com. You'll find everything you need to get better today. Join our free, friendly strategy group and start talking poker with our coaches and community. And listen, if you're ready to take poker more seriously, sign up for Core, our $5 a week complete training platform built for players who have limited time to study. Core is packed with with over 100 bite-sized lessons from the fundamentals to advanced strategies, quizzes, achievements, discussion threads, and more. And for the bravest of heart, we invite you to check out our pro membership, which includes 24/7 access to hundreds of videos, all of our playlists, all of our crash courses, and more. If you want to see what the top 1% of players are studying to keep their edges razor sharp, visit redchippoker.com/Ruby. That's RUBY, and get a special deal on your first 3 weeks. Until next time, run good, play better, and get there.